In the winter of 2018, a bioarchaeologist named Kristen Hedman was sorting through skeletal remains stored at the Illinois State Museum in Springfield. The bones had been excavated decades earlier from a site called Cahokia Mounds, a vast complex of earthen pyramids rising from the Mississippi River floodplain near what is now St. Louis. Her job that day was routine cataloging, and then she pulled a sample that stopped her. The isotope ratios in the tooth enamel didn't match the strontium signature, a chemical fingerprint locked into teeth during childhood that reflects the geology of the water and food a person consumes in their first years of life, pointed somewhere else entirely, not to the local bedrock, not to the floodplain, to a region hundreds of miles away. The individual had not grown up here. They had come from somewhere else, lived here long enough to be buried in one of Cahokia's most elaborately prepared mortuary pits, and then died. Hedman set the sample aside. Then she found another one, and another. For most of the 20th century, the story of Cahokia seemed straightforward. Around 1050 CE, something remarkable happened in the American Midwest. A settlement in the river floodplain of the central Mississippi Valley exploded. Within 2 generations, a modest village had become the largest city north of Mexico, a planned urban center covering more than 5 square miles, dominated by a platform mound the size of the Great Pyramid of Giza at its base. At its peak, sometime between 1050 and 1200 CE, Cahokia housed an estimated 10,000 to 20,000 people. The consensus explanation was elegant and internally consistent. The Mississippian cultural fluorescence, the explosion of mound building, long-distance trade, and complex ceremonial life that Cahokia represented, had been driven by local population growth. The people of Cahokia were descended from the woodland period communities that had occupied this floodplain for centuries before. The city didn't appear from nowhere, it grew from within. This model was supported by the archaeological record in ways that made it feel inevitable. Cahokia sat at the confluence of the Missouri, Illinois, and Mississippi rivers, the greatest inland waterway network on the continent. The agricultural productivity of the American bottom, the rich alluvial plain surrounding the site, could sustain dense population, and the material culture of Cahokia, its ceramics, its corn-based economy, its monumental architecture, showed clear continuity with earlier woodland traditions. Archaeologists drew arrows on maps. Local communities coalesced. Surplus agriculture funded specialists. Leaders emerged. The city grew. The model made geographic sense. It was published in textbooks. It became the framework within which Cahokia was understood, and for decades almost no one seriously questioned it. There was just one problem. Nobody had properly checked the DNA or the isotopes, and the few researchers who had begun to look were finding something that the local growth model could not explain. I want to be careful here about why this matters, because this is the part of the story that tends to get simplified into something it isn't. The question was never whether Cahokia had local roots. It did. The question was whether the explosive urban transformation that occurred around 1050 CE was driven entirely by the slow accumulation of local people and local surplus, or whether something else happened, whether people moved in large numbers from far away rapidly, and whether that movement was itself the engine of what Cahokia became. The tools to answer that question properly didn't exist for most of the 20th century. Strontium isotope analysis requires comparing local baseline signatures against individual teeth, and building those baselines for the American Midwest took decades. Ancient DNA extraction from North American remains had been politically and technically complicated since the early debates over nagpray, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, which fundamentally reshaped the ethical and legal landscape of skeletal research. And there was a third problem: sample size. The human remains from Cahokia had been excavated in multiple campaigns spanning decades, by different teams using different methods with widely varying levels of documentation. Before you could ask who came from where, you first had to assemble a reliable biological profile of who was there. That assembling work is what Hedman had spent much of her career doing. And by 2018, the data had accumulated to the point where a pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The first major publication came in 2015. Thomas Emerson, a Cahokia specialist at the Illinois State Archaeological Survey, and a team of colleagues, published a strontium isotope study of 133 individuals from Cahokia and surrounding sites in the American bottom, drawing on samples from the Mound 72 mortuary complex, the most intensively studied ritual burial deposit at the site. Mound 72 is unlike any other structure at Cahokia. It is a small ridge-top mound, only about 6 feet tall, but beneath it lie some of the most elaborate burial deposits ever found in the North American interior. At its core, archaeologists found the remains of 2 high-status males laid out on beaded blankets containing more than 20,000 marine shell beads arranged in the shape of a bird of prey. Surrounding them, the mass burials of at least 53 young women, their bodies arranged in rows with care. Elsewhere in the same complex, 4 males buried face down without their heads and hands, and beneath all of it, an even older sacrificial deposit. This was not a local village cemetery. This was a statement, a material argument about power, sacrifice, and cosmological order, built at the moment of Cahokia's founding. When Emerson's team analyzed the strontium signatures of the Mound 72 individuals, the results disrupted the local growth narrative. A significant proportion of the individuals buried in the mound, including several of the young women in the mass burial deposits, had strontium signatures inconsistent with local American bottom geology. They had grown up somewhere else. Some of them had come from the north, some from the south, some from directions that couldn't be determined without additional data, but the signal was clear. Cahokia's founding ritual deposits contained a substantial population of people who had not grown up in the American bottom. Then, in 2020, a team led by Emerson and including bioarchaeologist Philip Slater published a broader isotope study covering multiple sites and time periods at Cahokia. Their analysis of 135 individuals showed that non-local individuals, people whose childhood strontium signatures placed their origins outside the American bottom, were not concentrated at a single moment or a single location. They were distributed across the site's occupational history, and in some contexts, particularly in the early phases of Cahokia's urban florescence around 1050 to 1100 CE, non-local individuals accounted for roughly 30 to 50% of the sampled population. 3 in 10 people buried at Cahokia, by this analysis, had not grown up there. Let that settle for a moment. Now, 3 things make this finding hard to dismiss. First, what the evidence shows. The non-local isotope signatures cluster in ways that are geographically interpretable. The strontium ratios in many non-local individuals are consistent with origins in regions to the north and east, areas of glacially derived soils in what is now Wisconsin, Illinois, and Michigan, and to the south, in regions with different geological baselines along the lower Mississippi. This is not random scatter, it is directional. People were arriving from specific, distant places. Second, what it rules out. The slow local growth model. If Cahokia had been built by the gradual coalescence of surrounding woodland communities, the population should look overwhelmingly local. The existing woodland settlements of the American bottom have strontium profiles consistent with the floodplain geology. A city built by people who were already there would not show 30 to 50% non-local signatures in its founding generation. That number requires movement. Organized, large-scale, rapid movement of people from outside the region. Third, what it implies. The founding of Cahokia may have been less like a city slowly growing and more like a city that was built, deliberately, rapidly, and with participants drawn from a wide geographic catchment. This has direct parallels to other urban origin events in world history. The founding of early Mesopotamian cities that drew on tributary hinterlands, the construction of Teotihuacan, which genetic evidence now shows incorporated populations from Oaxaca and the Gulf Coast. The Mississippian world may have had its own version of this phenomenon. I spent a long time with the counterarguments here, and I want to be honest, they are not trivial. The most serious objection is methodological. Strontium isotope analysis is a powerful tool, but it has a precision ceiling. Strontium signatures identify childhood residence regions at roughly the scale of geological provinces. They can tell you someone grew up in a glacially derived soil region versus an alluvial floodplain, but they cannot pinpoint a specific community. Two people with identical signatures might have grown up 200 miles apart. More critically, the American bottom strontium baseline is not uniform. The floodplain itself contains microenvironmental variation, and the surrounding uplands have different signatures that can be mistaken for non-local when they are actually within 1 or 2 days' walk of Cahokia. Some researchers have argued that the non-local category in the 2015 and 2020 studies may be overcounting individuals who grew up in the local uplands rather than the floodplain proper. This is a legitimate caveat. It is also worth noting that even if you adjust the non-local estimate downward by half, you still have a founding population that is substantially more geographically diverse than the local growth model predicts. I rewrote this section 3 times because I kept finding papers that pulled in different directions on this specific point. The 2020 Emerson and Slater study was aware of the baseline criticism and attempted to address it through a more refined local reference population. Their revised estimates still showed non-local rates that are difficult to explain by local upland variation alone. The second major objection concerns ancient DNA. The isotope findings are suggestive, but isotopes tell you where someone grew up, not who they were genetically related to. The most direct test of the migration hypothesis would be whole genome ancient DNA from Cahokia individuals compared against genetic profiles of contemporary woodland populations in the potential source regions. That dataset does not yet exist at adequate scale. Ancient DNA research in the American Midwest has been constrained by a combination of preservation issues. The humid temperate climate degrades genetic material far faster than the cold, dry environments of northern Europe or Siberia, and the ethical obligations created by nag prey. Any serious ancient DNA study of Cahokia requires sustained, genuine partnership with the tribal nations whose ancestors are represented there, including the Osage Nation, the Quapaw Nation, and others who have maintained cultural and genealogical ties to the Cahokia region. Some of that partnership work is currently in development, but the data has not yet been published. What has been published is a different kind of evidence, and it connects the Cahokia question to something much larger. In 2020, a team led by geneticists David Reich and Johannes Kraus published a landmark study in Cell analyzing 173 ancient Native American genomes spanning the last 15,000 years. The study was not specifically about Cahokia, but it contained a finding that reframes the migration question for the entire eastern woodlands. When the team analyzed the genetic profiles of individuals from Mississippian period sites in the American Southeast, contemporaries and cultural relatives of Cahokia, they found evidence of significant gene flow events coinciding with the Mississippian cultural fluorescence. Populations that had been relatively isolated during the woodland period showed new genetic ancestry patterns emerging after 900 CE. This ancestry did not have a clear single source, it came from multiple directions. The Cahokia isotope findings suddenly look less like a local anomaly and more like one node in a continent-scale process. The Mississippian transformation. The spread of platform mound-building corn agriculture and a shared cosmological system across 1 million square miles of the North American interior appears to have involved real movement of real people, not just the diffusion of ideas through existing populations. This is a side note, but it is worth pausing on because it connects to something that sits at the heart of how we understand ancient America. For most of the 20th century, the dominant model of pre-Columbian North America treated populations as relatively stable and geographically rooted. Native peoples lived where they had always lived. Cultural change happened through contact and adoption, not migration. Movement was exceptional. That model is increasingly untenable. Ancient DNA from the Americas is revealing a continent defined by mobility, by populations that split, merged, relocated, disappeared, and were replaced with a frequency that parallels what we now document in ancient Europe and Western Asia. Cahokia may be one of the most dramatic expressions of that mobility in the North American archaeological record. There is one more dimension to the Cahokia story that the isotope and DNA evidence opens up, and it is the one I find hardest to let go of. The young women in Mound 72. We know from Emerson's 2015 study that several of them were non-local. They did not grow up in the American bottom. Their teeth encode the geology of somewhere else. A childhood in northern Illinois, in Wisconsin, in the river valleys that drain into the upper Mississippi. They arrived at Cahokia at some point in the mid-11th century, and at some point after arriving, they were killed or died and were buried together in a single deposit, the largest mass sacrifice yet documented in pre-Columbian North America north of the Rio Grande. The standard interpretation frames them as sacrificial victims given to the earth at the moment of Cahokia's founding, their deaths animating the cosmic order that the emerging Mississippian state needed to claim. But here is the question the isotopes put in front of us. Were they brought to Cahokia specifically for this purpose? Were they captives taken from distant communities during raids that preceded or accompanied the city's founding? Were they voluntary participants in a ritual system they had been raised within? Were they the daughters of allied communities, sent to Cahokia as symbolic bonds in a political network that was being assembled across the Mississippi watershed at the same moment the mounds were being built? The isotopes cannot answer that. The DNA, if it is ever extracted and sequenced with community consent, might be able to tell us which populations they came from, whether they were genetically similar to each other, suggesting they were from the same source community, or genetically diverse, suggesting they had been gathered from multiple directions. That would tell us something about whether Mound 72 represents a single raid, a single alliance, or something more complex. We don't have that answer yet. What we do have is a city that, for roughly 200 years, stood as the largest urban center in the territory that would become the United States. A city built, it now appears, at least partly by people who came from somewhere else. Drawn by something, by a political vision, by a religious movement, by coercion, by a hunger for belonging to something vast and powerful, to a floodplain at the center of a continent, to build mounds that are still standing 1,000 years later. Cahokia was abandoned by around 1350 CE. The population dispersed. The mounds remained. The people left no writing. They left no oral tradition that has been clearly identified as descending directly from the city's inhabitants. What they left is in the earth, in the strontium locked in the teeth of people who made journeys we cannot yet fully map, in the mitochondrial DNA still latent in petrous bones that have not yet been extracted, in the architecture of a city that could not have been built without a labor force drawn from beyond any single community's reach. The textbooks called Cahokia a local story, a people who simply grew into something remarkable. The bones are telling us it was also a story of strangers, of people who arrived from the north and the south and the east who built something together for 200 years, and then dispersed back into a continent so large that we are still trying to find out where they came from and where they went. Somewhere in a state museum in Springfield, Illinois, there are teeth still waiting to speak. We are still learning to listen.